Hello everybody. Today we're talking about Aftershock, the 7th book in the HIVE series, or as I like to call it, Book 1-2 or Book 4-2. It's definitely not Book 1-3 because Book 4 is not very much of a sequel or parallel to Book 1, but this book very elegantly mirrors both Book 1 and Book 4 in very, very interesting ways. The thing about Aftershock is, so I mentioned before that I did a little bit of a poll of the fandom before I started doing this project, and I asked everybody what their favorite book was. And the most popular was Rogue, but Aftershock actually only lost by 1 vote. It's a very well-received book, except there are a few people who don't like it. One of the people who don't like it is actually Mitch. Mitch contacted me at the beginning of this week and said, Jade, I knew I was going to have to miss a week, and if I'm going to miss a week, it's going to be Aftershock because I just don't care for it. And the thing about that is, I'm glad that this is the book that I don't get any help on. If there's any book on the planet that I can analyze, this is in the top 3. The thing about Aftershock is, for one, it's the first book that came out in the HIVE series after I caught up. So when I first started reading, 0 Hour had just come out, and I had about 6 months to sit on 0 Hour and sit on the series as a whole before Aftershock came out. And then there was a 2-year gap between Aftershock and the following book, Deadlock. So most of my time where I was actively involved in the fandom was either immediately preceding the release of this book and analyzing the back of the book description that had been released, or happened right after Aftershock came out, where everybody was talking about the events of this book. I've also talked a little bit on this channel about how I find relationships between 2 people interesting, and how I am frequently disappointed by love stories because I want to be able to analyze a lot of things about them, and I can't always, because the relationship is more based on something that isn't necessarily worth analyzing, or there's less depth to it because it's a romance. Aftershock is one of the first love stories that I really, really was able to dig my teeth into and was interested in digging my teeth into, because this book does a lot of very interesting things with the central love story of this series, and it does some things that really turned a lot of people off of both of the main characters in this book, but also does things that I thought were very ambitious and not what a lot of people were expecting. But HIVE as a series is, in my opinion, way better for the things that occur here in Aftershock and in Deadlock, which is largely like the part 2 to Aftershock. I've been saying there's a lot of really interesting things, but I should talk about what in it I think is actually done well. For one, I think this book is very, very ambitious, and not everything about this book lands. There are a lot of things about this book that don't land. There are things that Mark Walden tries to pull off that are handled very awkwardly. There is an immense focus on the rereadability of this book. If you read this book a second time, it is a far more interesting experience the second time, because the amount that you are designed to only pick up on a second read vastly eclipses the amount you are supposed to pick up on the first read, which I thought was very ambitious, and I admire Mark Walden for attempting, but there are some things that aren't entirely nailed. Second of all, the scale of this book is shrunk down so far, and it really does something wonderful to the book. The stakes at the end of book 6 were saving the planet and the human race from a runaway bucket of nanites that was going to turn the entire Earth into gray goo. But I don't think anybody believed that the Earth was going to be turned into gray goo, especially if you're reading this series later and you know that there are books that come after book 6. When I first started reading the series, I thought there were only going to be 6 books. So at the end of book 6, when the Earth might have ended, like, I still didn't think the Earth was going to end. But now, if you know there's 9 books, you're absolutely certain the Earth is definitely not going to end. In this book, the stakes are way smaller, and the bad guys win. Like the bad guys basically clean the floor with the good guys, okay, with glove, in this book. Because the stakes are way smaller, but the stakes are still devastating. I read this book, actually, so this book came out when I was 14. And I read this book the night before my first day of high school. So I received it in the summertime. I read the first couple of chapters, over the course of a couple days. And I got to about this far into the book, and I just decided to read the rest of it in one night. And I started reading it at like 9, and then I finished reading it probably 11:30. And I literally didn't sleep for the rest of the night because I was just sitting up thinking, oh my gosh, what did I just read? Because the cliffhanger in this it's awful, but the cliffhanger is also not that bad because the stakes are shrunk down, because the stakes are things that we care about. The cliffhanger isn't, oh no, is the Hive going to get exploded? Because we don't really think that that's going to happen. Or, okay, we don't think that's going to happen in book 7. I do think that's going to happen in book 9, though. We'll see. The stakes aren't, oh no, the Earth might end. The stakes are, a couple of our main characters have been captured, and Otto has been expelled from the Hive. So we have a massive paradigm shift for the coming book. Otto is no longer a Hive student. Laura, Nigel, Tom, and Penny are no longer Hive students because they now are physically somewhere else. And they're also in imminent danger. Nigel's status of being dead or alive is hanging in the balance at the end of this book. But I think most people assumed that he would be fine just by the way it's framed. However, we know that all 4 of the students at the glass house are in a dangerous situation, so we know that there's a high likelihood that they will be in another perilous situation in the following book. That part, the cliffhanger specifically, is masterfully well done. I also like the fact that Mark Walden set out to basically create a slow-moving train wreck. The first part of this book moves at a snail's pace, but it's also a snail's pace that I really enjoy. This is the second Hive book in the Hive series that takes place at the Hive. We see the kids doing stuff in school and planning their own little mission inside the school. We haven't had another book with this much focus on the titular institute since the first book. And I'm really glad that we got this. For one, it's a lot of fanfic fuel, but it also feels very grounded in what we thought the series was going to be at the beginning. We see a lot of daily life. We get a lot of material with the students. We see how the students affect each other. And we get the introduction of Tom and Penny. I mean, the reintroduction of Tom and Penny, but they only had like one line apiece back in book 1, so their characters are largely established in this one. And their integration is handled so much better than Lucy's. They really, even though they don't feel like part of the team, like they do feel a little bit separate from the other 6, they do feel like part of the cast by the end of this installment, which is really impressive and a massive improvement over book 4. We meet another student from outside the Alpha Stream. We find out a little bit about the way that Cole does his business. And yeah, Cole dies, but when we find out about some of the things that he's done in his 5 years as a student, we see just how different he is from the Alphas, which is really neat. One thing about this book, though, is that the prose is noticeably clunkier. Like, the sentence structure and the way the sentences flow feels worse than it did in 0 Hour. As far as the writing quality, I think the series kind of tops out at 0 Hour. Even though I think that the way a lot of things are executed is done better in this book than it was in 0 Hour. The actual like sentences, if you read it out loud, it's nowhere near as pleasant. In the Dreadnought analysis, Mitch talked about interiority, the points when we actually see what Otto is thinking. One thing about this book that is a little bit irritating, but is also kind of genius, is that we don't find out anything about what Otto is thinking in this book. It is all left up to you to figure out based on the way that Otto is acting and based on the things that he says and based on your memory of what happened in the previous books. And enough information is given to you, but you have to work for it. There are only 3 points in the story that I remember where we actually know what Otto is thinking because the narration tells us, and that's when he thinks that there must be a traitor in the group, the following morning in the cave when he thinks that he had nightmares, and then when he finds out that Laura is the traitor. And that's it. Everything else you are expected to figure out. But the thing is, this plays into the central gimmick of the story, which is there's this YouTube video, I think it was a PSA at one point, that is about these 2 high schoolers passing notes to each other in a library by scratching things into a desk or by leaving notes inside a desk, I don't remember. And at the end, the 2 students who are implied to be falling in love agree to meet up somewhere. And it turns out that what the PSA is about is that there was a student in the background who was planning a mass shooting. And the point of the ad is that you, the reader, missed all of the clues that this student was planning a mass shooting. And I think that is probably the best comparison to this book that there is. You are so concerned with other things that are going on, and Otto's thoughts and what Otto says so cleverly distract you from whatever is happening that you completely miss everything that's going on with Laura until you read it for a second time. But what this does is it instills this sense of guilt and self-blame in the audience. You didn't see this. Don't you feel bad that you missed it? Which is exactly what Otto is feeling at the end of the story. This guilt and self-blame is instilled in you, the reader. And so one of the things that this book does really well, does better than a lot of the other installments, I think, is instill specific emotions in you that aren't, haha, Shelby said something funny. A lot of the other books aim for a certain emotion and don't quite achieve it, such as with all of Lucy Dexter's character, certain aspects of Wing's story. This book, I think, Mark Walden manipulates you into feeling the things he wants you to feel better. And one of the things that is really well communicated in this book, probably the thing that is best communicated, is this feeling of loneliness. Little Natalia, throughout the flashback sequences, is very, very lonely, and it seeps into the word choice. It seeps into the atmosphere. The final scene with Laura, where she's in the glass house and crying over the uniform that she's having to have incinerated. You feel like the only person on the planet reading that sentence. And then in the final scene with Otto, where he is walking the streets of London, you begin to feel this loneliness as well. You're very, very concerned for him. And then you feel a relief when you see that he has companions with him. But you also know that those companions are not necessarily enough for him emotionally. So with all that in mind, I'd like to get started talking on the actual book, you know, but before we start, I just want to list out a couple of themes that I want to keep track of. One is family. We talk a little bit about Laura's parents. We find out that they had another child after she went to the Hive. Otto's father just died. The closest thing he has to siblings, Tom and Penny, are inducted into the Hive. We get a new villain, Anastasia Furin, who is the sibling of deceased villain Peter Furin. Otto has been obsessing over himself not having a family for a while, and the only person who has ever assured him that he could have a family in his group of friends was Laura, who prioritizes her own family over him in this book. We've got love and the lack of it. Natalia, it said, loves Dmitri. We don't know what kind of love, but we know that she loves him. And then his death causes some bad feelings in her. Joseph Wright was kicked out of the Glove ruling council and replaced with people who Nero wanted more, with Nero's own children, students. If the Hive is a location where everybody loves each other, the glass house is defined as the land of not that. We'll get back to the theme of love later because I literally wrote 2 pages of examples of that one. We get a lot of characters clinging desperately to optimism to the point that they're not able to see things directly in front of them. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Another recurring motif that we get in this one is improvement. The hack box that Otto and Laura build in this one is basically exactly what they were trying to do in book 1, except they do it correctly this time. Natalia goes from a very weak child to one of the scariest women on the planet in the flashback section of this book. Franz saves everyone on purpose this time, so he's gone from being the crouching moron hidden badass to an actual badass. And then Laura's ability to lie and manipulate everybody else is honestly kind of terrifying. So let's get started with the flashback plot. I think this is very firmly everybody's favorite past plot line, probably because it's so long and so detailed. But this plot line follows little Natalia. She's a little girl. She appears to be about 10 years old, living on the streets of Moscow. She's a pickpocket, a cut purse, and she's not particularly good at either of those things, but she's able to survive. She is picked on by a group of older boys, bigger boys, whose territory she's apparently been encroaching on when Anastasia Furin and her brother Peter show up and kill the 4 larger boys so that she can take her to the glass house. And that's something that I want to call attention to now so I don't forget to do it later. Anastasia does not take the bigger boys that have been holding territory on the streets of Moscow. She takes small, desperate, starving Natalia because she wants somebody she can break. She wants somebody who is going to have to learn everything from the glass house. She doesn't want somebody who is going to thrive in the glass house until after she's broken them. Later in this book, Anastasia takes 4 of the 8 Hive students back to the glass house with her. There are 4 students who have something like combat ability of the alphas that we know, and that's Otto, Shelby, Wing, and Franz. Those are the 4 that Anastasia leaves behind. She instead takes Tom, Penny, Laura, and Nigel because they are weak. Because, well, Tom and Penny aren't necessarily weak, but Nero doesn't have his hooks into them. Laura and Nigel are smaller, fragile. They will have a harder time adjusting to the glass house, and so she's more likely to be able to break them. If Shelby had gone to the glass house, if Wing had gone to the glass house, they would have just stomped all over whatever students she already had there and been able to potentially find a way out or or maintain their sanity long enough to be able to leave in some capacity. Anastasia doesn't want that kind of person. She wants blank slates. She wants people she can turn into blank slates. And that's what Natalia is. She erases, or Anastasia erases Natalia, the girl, and creates Raven, someone who has nothing in common with the Natalia that there used to be. And we get the sort of arc words for the coming set of books where Anastasia says, "You will find as you grow older that choice is rarely more than an illusion." And that is Anastasia's whole modus operandi. Maybe the best thing that Aftershock contributes to the Hive series is the addition of Anastasia Furin. Anastasia is an absolutely terrifying and hate-worthy villain. She was maybe actually the first fictional character I ever truly despised. There were other villains in other books that I had read up to this point that I read about and I was like, oh, this is a bad guy, so eventually they're going to get defeated. I read about this woman and I wanted her to die. Like I was angry with her. Overlord was the guy with the red mask. Of course he wasn't gonna make it. Anastasia made me very angry. And the reason for this is because she's devastatingly effective. She doesn't give anybody the opportunity to make any choices. She's, in this book, she, along with Laura, achieves what every other villain has tried to do. She wipes out the Alpha Stream. I should have been keeping track of how many other books have had the element of somebody trying to wipe out the Alpha Stream, none of which work until Anastasia does it in this book. And Nero doesn't even see it coming. All of the other, Cypher and Hive Mind pretending to be Overlord and all those people said, do this or I will start killing children. Anastasia doesn't give a warning. She just does it. She finds a way to do it, and she does it, and it works. She doesn't give anybody any kind of warning for anything. When Dimitri tries to escape the glass house later, she pulls out a gun and she shoots him, and then he dies. There's no bullshit with her. There's no theatrics. And that's really the core of the concept of the Disciples. Glove is 60s Batman villains. They're silly. They wear funny costumes. They have death rays. Anastasia is a modern villain, or the Disciples are all modern villains. The kinds of people you see in stories today, in movies today. There's no silly costumes. There's no lasers. It's, I'm going to start mowing people down and I'm not going to give you any warning. They're terrorists. They're terrifying people. They're not silly. And Anastasia embodies that to the extreme. So she drags little Natalia to the glass house, which is a training camp in Siberia, where Natalia meets Dimitri, a boy who's her age who has been at the glass house a little bit longer than her and is a better fighter. He has a friend named Tolia who appears to be not younger but like less mature than the other two. Dimitri is her sparring partner. They're the first sparring partner that she has. And Peter says that she's not hitting him, she's pecking at him like a raven. And the nickname sticks. And the interesting thing is, and I'm not sure if this is heartwarming or not, so we know that, we've known all along that Peter gave her the nickname Raven because it was brought up in book 4. But the thing is, she could have always picked a different name. She could have shed it. But she decided to keep it, and for what reason? What this makes clear is that the name Raven doesn't refer to what Peter called her. I mean, it does, but what it really refers to is her connection to Dimitri. When she continues to go by Raven even into, 20 years later, she's honoring Dimitri, not Peter, which is very sad. But it shows something interesting about what Hive the series considers about childhood. That childhood is something that can define your life. She only knew Dimitri for 2 years, and yet she takes a name that honors him specifically, which ties into the whole theme of Nero running this school, and basically the alphas that graduate from the Hive, their lives are defined by those 6 years they spend there. Or their lives are influenced, determined by the 6 years that they spend there. A couple of years later, Dimitri tries to escape the glass house and has enough packs to bring Raven and Tolia with him, but because he's the most experienced, he tries to retrieve everything by himself. But he's caught. Anastasia shoots him and takes Natalia and Tolia into it puts them in solitary confinement to see which one of them goes insane first, and it's Tolia. So she forces the two of them to fight to the death. She places 2 katanas between them and forces them to fight to the death because Tolia has completely lost it at this point. Natalia is having to defend herself from Tolia, who is just raging. And she eventually wins, which gives us, the other part of current Raven's character, which is that she has these 2 swords, are a tribute to Tolia, are a tribute to her final fight with Tolia. She also, she gets a scar on her left, she gets a cut on her left cheek during this fight, but it's unclear whether this is her actual scar that she still has. I'm not sure. And after this, Natalia continues to try to put up resistance to Anastasia. She makes it her personal plan to kill Anastasia one day. She wants to put things in place so that eventually she will be able to cut Anastasia down. She refuses to kill the other children, but she's also separate from them. She can't relate to them, something that we're going to get to when we get to Otto. And she starts hallucinating talking to Dimitri because she doesn't have anyone that she can talk to. Eventually, psychologically, she snaps and attacks one of the other children. In the final scene of the book, and also the final scene from her perspective, we see her cut down 12 adult men in service to Anastasia as her final test before she's told that she will be given her first real target, which is to kill Maximilian Nero. For one, I'm going to add little Natalia to the kill count list. So currently she sits at 13, 12 kills from the guards, and 1 is Tolia. But the thing about this is, we learn 2 major things here. 3. 1, we get introduced to the character of Anastasia, who is a terrifying and extremely effective villain because she's willing to do whatever it takes. She has no morals. She has no standards. If she needs to do something, she will do it. I mean, the woman runs a boot camp in the middle of Siberia for children that are way younger than the students at the Hive, because she doesn't care about killing kids, or rather, she knows that killing kids will get her closer to her goals, and she just doesn't have any morals on that front. Second of all, we learn about the glass house, and I'm really hoping that this isn't something that is confirmed in Deadlock, because this is a theory that I have, so I hope this is an actual theory and not just me remembering, but the Hive has to be based on the glass house. Like, it has to be based on the glass house, because the glass house is the Hive, except actually evil. Hive as a location is a place that's really trying to teach children that will eventually go out on their own in the world. The glass house is supposed to be producing personnel that will remain under the control of the disciples. But the similarities that the two have is that it's all about control. It's all about weakening the psyche of the students until you're able to define their thought processes. It's all about making them feel like they have no choice, which is okay if it's Nero, because we know Nero means the best for the kids. It's not even okay if it's Nero, but I'm sure we'll get back to that in a later book, since half the point of 0 Hour was to show that maybe it's not okay even if it's Nero. But in the case of Anastasia, she doesn't care about the children. She kind of hates the children individually. So it's really, really not okay for her to be doing these things, because she doesn't even have the best intentions. And then we find out the backstory of Raven. The thing about this book is that as I've been rereading this entire series, I was so impressed by how many things seemed to be leading up to this book specifically. Because you don't think of this book as being one of the ones that will be leading up to anything, because the major plot twist in this book only consists of things that happen in this book. You know, the plot twist in this book is that Laura is a traitor, but she only starts being a traitor at the beginning of this book. So you don't think of this book as being something that there will be foreshadowing for in prior installments, but there absolutely is. For one, in book 2, when Wing is shot in front of Otto, Raven acts a lot like she knows exactly what to do in this situation, because she has lost childhood friends while she was a child that were shot in front of her, or that she had to kill herself. She has experience with this, and she knows how to treat Otto as a person, you know, when he sees this. And that was really cool, actually. Hello, everybody. It's Jade from the future. So, I told you that Mitch was not going to be able to join us this week, but someone did reach out to add a little bit to this week's discussion of Aftershock. Silver Bengal, or Nessa, as we call her, is a friend of mine and Mitch's over the internet. And she had the following to say about the relationship between Natalia, Peter, and Anastasia. Until my most recent reread, I had always thought of Peter as a slightly scarier version of the generic supervillain's bodyguard, Anastasia's tough but ultimately unremarkable henchman, who exists in Raven's backstory just to torture her. I only realized this time around just how vital he is in helping Anastasia break Raven. How much his genuine malice and how much he's acting under Anastasia's orders isn't entirely obvious, but the two have a deadly good cop, bad cop routine, and it allows Anastasia to essentially groom Raven. When they come to take her from Moscow, it's Peter who shoots Boris and his gang, and Anastasia sets herself at odds with him right from the start. Come with me, or Peter will shoot you. Immediately, she sets herself up as the only thing standing between Raven and a dangerous man who wants to kill her, and her smiling and holding out her hand, a slightly disturbingly maternal gesture, adds to that. This gets piled on more and more as the years pass. With one exception of killing Dmitri, Anastasia is never physically violent, and she absolutely never hurts Raven. Peter, on the other hand, hits her, shoots her, and chokes her. He openly wants her dead, even comes within seconds of killing her himself on 2 occasions. On the only one she's conscious for, it's Anastasia who saves her by calling him off. And in the conversation that follows, which Raven is still present for, Anastasia says that as soon as Raven has served her purpose, Peter can do what he likes with her. Once again, it's clear that Anastasia is the only thing between Raven and Peter, and that her protection is conditional. The whole effect is enhanced by the fact that Anastasia calls her Natalia, or my dear, while Peter never once calls her Natalia, nicknaming her Raven on her first day and sticking with it. After her episode, Anastasia is the only one who calls her Natalia. We can assume that after she nearly killed a classmate, the others would be too afraid. Anastasia uses Peter to make herself Raven's protector, someone whose approval she needs to keep in order to survive, and that makes her much easier to break than she would have been without Peter. I thought that was a very interesting observation. I had never really thought about Peter Furin before, because I I looked for personality traits in him in the first 3 books that he was in, beyond Ruthless Killing Machine, and I didn't find very many. But the fact is that even though he is somewhat one-dimensional in his desires, he isn't one-dimensional in the way that Mark Walden used him. And I thought that was very interesting. So thanks to Nessa for participating this week, and back to our regularly scheduled programming. I've got a couple other, crazy theories about this whole situation with, I think that the Contessa knew these people at some point because of the whole choice, no choice distinction, and how Lucy's mom had there always has to be a choice catchphrase. I think it came from trying to contrast with Anastasia, but that's just a theory. Also, I think Constance and Verity probably also came from the Glass House, since they were disciples, and at one point in Escape Velocity, Constance says, "What a waste of a bullet," which is Anastasia's catchphrase, but ultimately that's just speculation. So let's move on to the present day plot. So what actually happens in this book overall is that Joseph Wright, as well as some other people who used to be on the Glove Council, are convinced by Minerva, who is the leader of the disciples and also is Anastasia Furin, to basically turn over to the side of the disciples and help her tear down Nero in retribution for kicking them off of the council. For one, I swear, back in my BookTube video when I said that the only way for Nero to really be able to control the Glove ruling council is if everybody on the council was HIVE students, I really wasn't thinking about this plot. It just kind of came out. I didn't mean to say that. But we're seeing now how even that isn't enough. Nero felt like he needed more control over the council, and so he fired everybody and hired in former students of his, but obviously, the people that he fired aren't just going to go away. They're not just going to disappear unless he kills them, which is something he wasn't willing to do. So they get picked up by the next person who's willing to take them. And of course, Anastasia Furin would love to have a bunch of people who are really, really angry with Nero and also have a ton of resources and power. Nice job breaking it, Nero. But also, part of Laura's arc in this book comes from the fact that her parents had another child after she left for the Hive, and you get the sense that they replaced her, right? Our daughter is a criminal, so we're gonna have another kid to replace the one that I feel like Joseph Wright is supposed to parallel Laura in that way, because Nero got rid of him and brought in his own children. Yeah, I don't have very much else intelligent to say about him, though, because he actually doesn't get that much screen time. However, his resources are used to take out the alphas, which he's a bad person. The thing about this book is that it really interestingly explores what it is to be a protagonist, because Raven is the closest thing that this book has to a protagonist, sort of, because she has an extremely active role in what's going on. We get her backstory in this book. We see her doing her job, which is to run the hunt, and then she loses a bunch of the students, but gains them all back. Well, gains a few of them back and is trying to protect them, but at the end of the story, she meets this shadowy figure from her past and has to start out on a quest to take her out again for realsies the second time, which is cool because it's sort of like the first 2 or 3 segments of the story circle if Raven is the hero. But also something that happens in this book is Mark Walden repeatedly takes advantage of your expectations of Otto being the protagonist. And the way that he does this is through the character of Chief Decker. Chief Decker is this woman who has been hired to be the new security chief to replace Chief Lewis. And she is a spy. And supposedly she's been messing with, quote, Otto Malpence and his friends for the past few months, but the person that we actually see her messing with is Laura. However, she repeatedly emphasizes a fascination with Otto specifically. Even though she actually talks to Laura, she tells Nero that she's concerned about Otto, because what she's actually trying to do is cover up her relationship with Laura. That sounded bad. Cover up the fact that she's, blackmailing Laura with a fascination with another student who's close to Laura. She also takes advantage of this later when she tells Cole Harrington to kill Otto and Laura, because she wants to cover up her connection to Laura's leak within the school. Talk about Otto. You know how I was just saying that with Raven, she felt very isolated from the rest of the students after she killed Tolia. Otto has like a minor version of that throughout this book. He appears to feel very separate from the rest of the students for a variety of reasons. So the thing about Otto in this book is that we don't see inside his head very much. It's been several months since 0 Hour, so he's had a lot of time to stop feeling the emotions involved in that event so acutely, but he also isn't like doing super well. You can only really tell in a couple of sentences that he says. For example, so let's count the issues that he has in this book. For one, he feels guilt over Lucy's death. He brings this up 3 times. First, he brings it up when he's waiting with Wing and Shelby for Laura to come back from talking to Chief Decker. He says that he wishes that he didn't have his implant because of all of the stress, because all the danger it puts his friends in. And Wing says, it's okay. We know that you don't want to be doing this to us, and we love you anyway. And then later, the same day, he's trying to offer Wing help with his homework, and he thinks that he would rather have had to study for his exams if it meant he didn't have this implant in his head. So he feels guilt over involving his friends in things. He feels guilt over the fact that one of his friends, Lucy, died in the last book. And then the third instance of this is that he tells Laura later that he had been avoiding her because he was afraid that something would happen to her, the same thing that happened to Lucy, because they were romantically involved. So he feels guilty for being around his friends since he's a danger magnet. And then this comes up at the end of the story in a really interesting way. We'll talk about that later. He says he's convinced that his days are numbered. He appears to be barely treading water, but gets comfort from being around his friends. He seems to be a little bit just pretending everything is okay, but it comes out in these little moments that he's struggling. He's constantly thinking about how he hates the implant and what it represents. And then the whole I was mind controlled into killing many people thing, yeah, he's still got some issues over that. The thing is that this book could have ended at book 6. This series could have ended at book 6, right? He's a free boy now that Overlord is dead. But, Otto's issues aren't over, like we said. So now that Overlord is dead, Otto's arc is about defining what he will be now that he's quote-unquote free. He doesn't feel like he belongs to Overlord anymore, but he also has, no sense of self either. He still has the damage. He just has less of a direction to point it at. And that means fundamentally the rest of the series will be defining what the implant will be used for, because like we've said before, almost all of Otto's traits come from his implant, his eidetic memory and all that stuff. Everything that makes him who he is influenced by the fact that he has this implant. So we can't just take it out. There won't be anything left. He has to come to terms with it. He has to accept it. Or die. So Chief Decker pulls Laura to the side, and it looks like she's harassing her. So later on, Laura comes to the other students and says, I would like to steal the exam questions for the entire school and give them out to everybody so that Chief Decker will look incompetent because I don't like this woman anymore. And all of the other students go, all right, let's do it. Except for Wing, who's kind of iffy on it, but he agrees to go along with it eventually. And that's basically the plot of the first half of the book. But the thing that's really cool about this plot is that it's an improvement. They're basically doing exactly what they tried to do in book 1, except they do it correctly this time. And there's a couple of things that are different. One, the students are older. The students are better at programming. We find out in this book that Laura is definitively a better hacker than Otto, when previously his implant made him a better hacker than her. She's improved to the point where she's better than his implant. And also, Otto has been improving outside of just using his implant as well. They also bring Nigel along this time, and Nigel plays a pivotal role in the plan. So instead of leaving Nigel behind so that he's not dead weight, instead it says that Otto and Laura spent a lot of time training him to do the right thing so that they could bring him along. I want to talk about Wing and Shelby a little bit. So a big theme of this installment is loneliness and isolation, like we saw with Natalia, but also like we see with Otto towards the end of the book and at the beginning when he feels separate from everyone else. Oh yeah, that's another one of his issues. He talks about how he doesn't feel like he's human because he came from a cloning vat and he's part machine. So normally he can rely a little bit on the sense of camaraderie that he has between his friends, but the balance of the group has been kind of thrown off, and that is specifically because Wing and Shelby are now dating. Every single conversation that Wing has with Otto in this entire book inevitably becomes about Shelby, because Wing's entire life right now is kind of about his relationship with Shelby. You know what? Good for Wing. I know that this is a good thing for him, and Otto is happy for him too, and Otto likes Shelby and all that stuff, and that's fine. But it also means that Otto isn't getting the same amount of support. The group has been kind of thrown off. On top of that, this has kind of isolated Shelby from Otto as well, and he's staying away from Laura because of what happened to Lucy. So Otto is kind of left without anybody he can really confide in. He's able to hang out with the rest of the group, but he's not getting the same amount of help from just being around them that he used to. So now let's talk about Tom and Penny. I bet you $100 that Mark Walden knew he wanted to bring them back, but he tried to give them as few character traits as possible so that he could come up with their characters later. Yeah. Tom and Penny are really good characters that are integrated really, really well with the team, but they're integrated so well that I really hope Mark Walden did this on purpose, because if he did do it on purpose, this is ridiculously impressive. Tom is the red herring for the traitor for almost everybody that reads this. Every single person I know, okay, other than one specific example that we'll get to later, every single person I know who read this book thought that Tom was a traitor. And there's absolutely nothing that indicates that Tom was the traitor, except for Shelby continually flirts with him. So you are sort of primed by this to dislike Tom. You feel like there's something off about him because Shelby isn't supposed to flirt with anybody that isn't Wing. And I think that this contributes to the feeling that everybody gets that Tom is the imposter, because if Lucy was the perfect love interest for Otto that was basically written to be exactly what Otto, quote unquote, needs, Tom is that to Shelby. And so we see him and we're like, oh my God, not this shit again. And also he's new. We have no idea what he's been up to for the past couple of years. They say they've been stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, but who knows? And it turns out they have that is actually the truth. That is what they were doing. Tom is not the imposter. He's just a dude that gets caught up in this crazy situation. But one of the things that we find out about them is that they used to be doing these cons where they were stealing money from the rich. And first they were keeping it for themselves, and then they were giving it to the poor. as they eventually had enough money that they didn't really feel like they needed anymore. The thing about this is that, like I said, these two characters are the closest thing to a blood family that Otto really has, because he grew up with them in the same orphanage. And at the end of this book, we see Otto scrubbing the facial recognition data from an ATM, because he's become a little bit of a vigilante himself, like just a little bit, now that he's back in the real world, in a way that sort of reminds me of Tom and Penny. And I thought that was neat. Even though they were never really close, they do sort of have the same bones. So I want to talk a little bit about the scene where Otto and Laura are sitting in Laura's room working on the hack box. I've talked a little bit about this scene before, but there's a lot to it. Let's get started with this. Otto says, "It was just a bit weird to see Tom and Penny again. It just seems so long ago, life before this place. Sometimes I feel like I'm never going to see the real world again, that I'm never going to leave. Do you know what I mean?" "Of course I do," Laura said. "I'm sure we all feel like that sometimes, but there's going to be a life after HIVE, for all of us. Assuming we survive until then," Otto said. This ties directly back into the conversation that Otto was having with Lucy at the beginning of 0 Hour, where he says that he doesn't know what his future is going to be like. Previously he was saying, "I don't think I want to be a supervillain." Now he's saying he can't see himself outside of the HIVE. And I think a lot of the reason why we don't see very much into Otto's head in this book is because my interpretation of this scene is that Otto thinks he's going to die before he turns 18. I can't see it any other way. He sees himself as something radioactive, as something that puts other people in danger. He can't. It's not that he doesn't know what he wants to do with himself after he leaves. It's that he doesn't think he's going to make it. And the thing is, a former friend of mine once told me that the definition of depression to some people is the inability to see your own future or see anything worth looking forward to in your own future. And that's basically where Otto is at. He still thinks of himself as someone who's a danger to the people around him. He has kind of lost his best friend to a relationship that ultimately, while good for Wing, is not good for Otto. And he's pretty much resigned himself to never having the romantic relationship that he wanted at the beginning of 0 Hour. But where in 0 Hour, Lucy had something valuable to say here to Otto to help him, Laura doesn't. She is thinking about something else right now. She says, "There's a life after HIVE for all of us," which is a worthless platitude. It does not add anything of value to this conversation, really. It's just sort of blind optimism. But the thing is, that blind optimism is all that Laura is clinging to right now, because she has her own set of issues going on. Because and this is one of those things that only makes sense on a reread and is greatly enhanced by a reread. She encourages him to stay optimistic because she herself is clinging desperately to optimism. She has to believe that there is a life where she leaves here and everything is still okay. Right now, at this point in the story, Laura is still feeling very confident in her ability to finish this mission and save her parents. Because the thing is, she's not confident in her own ability to shoot a gun. She's not confident in her own ability to do certain acrobatic stunts. But she knows for sure that her ability to hack into computers is a borderline superpower at this point. And that is what is being asked by her to save her parents, and she feels like she can do it. However, after this, she asks Otto a question. She asks him basically if she remembers something that he told her back in book 5, the thing that he whispered to her after he woke up from the animus, and it turns out later that he told her that he loved her. She asks him whether he meant it in this scene. And the thing is that while Otto is not doing well, like, Laura isn't doing well either. Her parents just had another kid, and it's almost impossible to not interpret this as them trying to replace her, or not seeing her as viable. She is also, she states later that she blames Nero for not telling her that she had a sibling. So she's irritated with her parents, she's irritated with Nero. Shelby is doing something else with her time, which is, dating. And Lucy is dead. So what Laura is feeling right now is she's feeling distinctly unloved. The question here isn't really, she's not really asking whether Otto loves her because she wants a relationship with him or whatever, which she does, but that's not really the point. She only has one additional source of love that she can draw on at this point, and it's Otto. And it's been destabilized. As Mitch said last week, she'll never be able to compete with Lucy because Lucy is dead. Otto will never be able to choose Laura over Lucy because Lucy died. But the thing about Otto is that right now he's not doing well. I think that if Shelby hadn't walked in here, he would have explicitly turned her down. He feels useless, and he's afraid of what it means just to be around Laura. He feels guilty and unstable being around all of his friends, but the issue he's having right now is with Laura most of all. So now we gotta talk about Cole Harrington. So Cole Harrington is this fifth-year political science student or political financial student who thinks that he's so much smarter and more capable than all of the alphas. And he's kind of justified in thinking so, just like not to the degree that he thinks he is. We find out about some of the things that he's been doing, such as like bribing security guards, and he has connections outside of the Hive and stuff, which is not even something that any of the alphas have thought about. Even Franz, who is the closest thing to a economics student, or closest thing to a political financial student that we haven't heard about him having connections to any money outside of the Hive. And then Otto had the connection to the United States president. He was able to use at the end of book 6. That was really cool, but he only had that because, he and the president were literally kidnapped by the same people. So it was mainly just a coincidence that Otto was able to use to his favor, but a coincidence nonetheless. So the way that the political students use their abilities and education is so different, which is really interesting and cool. Especially because the Contessa the Contessa died, so they actually had a switch in teachers between what would have been Cole's second and third year or something, I don't know. That was 2 years ago. Yeah. So Cole has learned from a couple of different teachers, and he appears to be a particularly effective political financial student. However, he correctly deduces that Otto isn't as dangerous as everybody thinks he is, which, good, but he thinks that Otto is way less dangerous than he actually is, which is bad. So we find out later that Cole has been told by Decker that he needs to get the source code of Hive Mind from Otto and Laura, and then she will be able to sell it for a lot of money on the black market. And that in the process, he needs to kill Otto and Laura to cover up his tracks. What this actually is Chief Decker is covering up her own tracks by getting Cole to kill Otto and Laura. At the end of this book, Otto explains the entire plot to Nero, and honestly, I needed it, because at this point I had no idea what Cole was doing, and what role he could possibly play. He's basically been sent to kill Laura, is really his role. and everything else is just kind of a vehicle to get him to do that. So the Alphas pull their whole heist thing where they shut down Hive Mind and then safely bring him back up. Or they shut down part of Hive Mind and then safely bring him back up, which is a significantly more advanced version of the thing that they tried to do in book 1. In book 1, they were like, okay, we'll just basically cut the power to Hive Mind unsafely and hope that it doesn't kill him. In this one, they know exactly what they need to cut the power to so that Hive Mind can safely be shut down and then brought back up. And it works. Hive Mind is none the wiser, and he loses nothing other than time. It's a very, very impressive heist, especially because they are able to integrate all 8 members of the team, including Tom and Penny, who are now on the team. But what happens is they transfer the files to Otto and Laura's black boxes, melt the hack box, which is a pretty cool invention, actually, and then they're prepared to go back to sleep so that they can execute the rest of the plan their following day, when they are approached by Cole Harrington and the 2 people that he has hired, Block and Tackle. One minor complaint about the series: why can't we get other henchmen other than Block and Tackle? They literally can't be the only henchmen. They can't. But they're the only henchmen that we ever meet. Anyway, maybe we'll meet more later. I don't know. Crossing our fingers. But, so Block and Tackle are hired by Cole, who tells them that he will pay them a bunch of money. And the fact that they believe him is like... Anyway, so Cole hires them to capture Otto and Laura. Decker told Cole that it was Otto that would have the code as part of her whole covering up her tracks thing. So Cole tells Otto to give over Hive Mind source code and all the files, or he will break, or either Block or Tackle, I don't remember which one, will break Laura's arm. And Otto just does it. At first he's like, I'm not going to give you anything, and then as soon as the concept of hurting Laura is put into place, he's like, oh no, never mind, you can have it. Why is this important? Because it ties back into the overarching conflict of this entire story, which is Laura's family is being threatened, and so she doesn't even think about the implications of handing over the location of the hunt. She does it. And while I judged her pretty harshly for not thinking about, well, why didn't you realize this would be used to kill everybody at the hunt? The thing is that Otto makes the exact same calculation here. Person I care about is being threatened, therefore I need to act and just give the person whatever they want. Even if in this case it's Hive Mind source code, which if that was put out into the public, that would be terrible. There would be a ton of other AI that would spring up. It's frankly a miracle that didn't get put out on the black market. That would have been awful. But Otto isn't thinking quickly enough to realize that, or to weigh, is the danger of this more important than Laura? He's not able to make that calculation because the person is in danger right now. And that's basically the situation that Laura is in this book. So Cole thanks Otto for the file and tells Block and Tackle to kill Otto and Laura. But fortunately, Chief Decker and Raven and Nero walk in because Hive Mind has noticed something is funny and sounded the alarm. Which, great job, Hive Mind. So Cole makes up some bullshit story about how, Otto told me to come here and tries to sell me the exam papers. And then he attacked me and stuff. So Nero asks, is this true? And so what Otto does is he transfers the files over to Cole's black box so that it looks like he stole it. And then he comes up with this absolutely watertight excuse for what was going on. It says, of course not. It was Harrington who stole the data, but it wasn't really the exam papers he was after. He's also stolen Hive Mind source code, and he's planning to sell it on the black market. He came and unlocked mine and Laura's quarters and brought us down here to the atrium. He thought that with our abilities we'd be able to help him transmit the source code off the island. He offered us a cut of the profits and showed us the files. They were all on his black box. When I said I was going to report him, he knew he had to silence me. So he tried to get these 2 idiots to do his dirty work for him. What did Otto just do here? He killed Cole Harrington. Like, 100% he knows that what will happen to Cole is that Nero will kill him. Nero will kill him. And Otto arranged it so that Cole would be killed. He killed him as surely as if he had killed him himself, except he exported the job to Nero. This lie is so watertight and so convincing, but also, he basically says that Cole was putting the school in danger, and that Cole was going to get Hive information off of the island, which is basically punishable by death. So he arranges for Cole to die. That's crazy. And for that reason, I'm counting this as a kill for Otto. Like, this is absolutely somebody that Otto has killed, because even though Otto doesn't actually kill him, he dies because of Otto's actions. But the absolutely crazy thing about this is what happens the following day. Laura returns to her room and cries. And Shelby actually comforts her, which is kind of surprising because on a reread, I was very surprised by how little Shelby is supportive of Laura. Like, she's very supportive of her in combat, and she clearly cares very much for her, but Shelby's love language, shall we say, is not really, telling other people that things will be okay. The majority of Laura's emotional support comes from Otto. But here Shelby actually, realizes that something is really, really wrong and talks to her a little bit. And one of the things she says is she refers to herself as Aunt Shelby, something that she says a couple of times in here. Now, I'm not sure who pointed this out first, but this was an amazing find that somebody had. The reason she calls herself Aunt Shelby is because she's dating Wink. What the heck does that mean, you're asking? Because Wing is Otto's uncle. Wing's parents programmed Overlord, who is Otto's dad. Wing is Otto's uncle, and that makes Shelby Aunt Shelby. That's hilarious. Anyway, and then the following day, Otto sits everybody down and recounts the whole story of how they were captured by Cole, and they had to come up with a lie that would get him killed and all that stuff. And now Cole is out of their hair. And he also says that he was able to retain the location of the hunt. And Laura volunteers to go do some research on it. And the thing that's really, really interesting about the Cole Harrington scene is how it changes everyone's perspective on the story. Before this, everybody was sort of taking things less seriously than they are after this point. For one, Tom is constantly talking about, oh, I think I'm gonna like it here, and oh, this place is the greatest and stuff. And then after he finds out about what happened with Cole Harrington, he's like, wow, this place is significantly less fun than I thought it was. It shifts Laura's mindset as well, because at first she's thinking, oh, well, of course I can save my parents. This will be easy. I'll just hack into the most secure computer system on the planet and then I'll be done. But then overnight, she's afraid that she wasn't able to get the data, and therefore she thinks that her parents are going to die. And so for the rest of the book, she's really, really concerned with what the consequences of her actions are, because now she's actually had time to think, wait, crap, this isn't going as smoothly as I thought it would be. This wasn't easy. I almost died. What are going to be the consequences of this? And from here on out, she's constantly distracted and constantly concerned with the hunt. She's the one that wants to take the file to Decker. She's always worried about what's going to be done with the information. And then after all of the children are killed, she's like, hey, has anybody heard about how many people survived? How many people died? What's going on? Because things became real for her after the Cole Harrington thing. At first, she was clinging to blind optimism, and now she can't. She can't cling to blind optimism anymore. But the other person that's really impacted by this is Otto. At first, he was sort of treading water in his, well, I'm dangerous to other people, but at least if I maintain my distance, nothing bad will happen thing. But the whole thing with Cole Harrington actually improves his confidence. It's bizarre. I mean, it's not bizarre. It's kind of exactly what you would expect from Otto, but also worrying. Like, he, at first, like I said, I don't think he would have said anything to, like, I think he would have rejected Laura in the previous scene with her. But after this happens with Cole Harrington, he realizes a couple of things. One, that bad things will happen to Laura whether he's there or not, or whether it's because of him or not. He had nothing to do with the Cole Harrington thing. He was just there. Like, that wasn't an overlord thing. That was this guy wants something that I'm also tangentially involved in. And so he realizes that he's not the only danger to Laura. But also what happened is he was able to actually protect Laura here. He was able to go after her enemies and kill him. And so he has the confidence to approach her the following day and ask her out. Confidence that he didn't have before killing Cole Harrington. Otto realizes that Laura is just a danger magnet, and that this time he was able to protect her because he was there, and that expecting her to just drop dead in front of him is only superstition. I mean, good for him, I think. But then she basically tells him, all right, thank you for the offer, but I have to go wash my hair. No. She says, I would like to talk to you about this after the hunt is over, because she has finally realized that giving away the location to the hunt is probably a bad idea, and she's afraid of what the consequences are. So she says, listen, it's not that I'm turning you down, it's that I would like to revisit this topic after the hunt is over, because we need to see what the consequences of my actions are. It's funny how she thinks there's going to be an after the hunt. Anyway, but the really clever thing that the library scene does is that, most people think that Tom is the traitor. But part of the reason why you don't think it's Laura is because of this scene. Because you think that this book is about protecting Laura from whatever the danger is, and not that Laura is the danger, right? This scene makes it seem like the end of the story is going to be protecting Laura from whoever the traitor is. And that's not what it's about. So I think that was a really good construction. So then they go on the hunt. And what the hunt is it's this Arctic expedition where Raven and her hand-selected team hunts down each of the alphas. So basically the alphas are given like an hour head start, and then Raven and her team go after and see which of the students can stay away the longest. And so far, no one has beaten 24 hours. And so the whole group of alphas the whole time is talking about, all right, how are we going to maximize our chances at beating the 24-hour record? And one of the things they do is research the location they're going to be at so that they can have the best advantage. And they make it 6 hours and 13 minutes. Anyway, they make it 6 hours and 13 minutes because the helicopters are attacked by the disciples. Because the disciples know where they are. Oops. And we have to count out a couple of kills. So for one, I'm going to count helicopters as 3 kills apiece, because I'm assuming that each of the helicopters is a pilot, a co-pilot, and a gunner, but it's not always specified. So this cover is actually a scene where Laura and Shelby are being chased down by this helicopter. They hide behind a rock, and then Otto comes out and uses his powers to explode the helicopter. And and I would call that 3 kills for Otto. So he's got 4 kills in this book, the helicopter, and then Cole Harrington. So what follows is a very cool Arctic expedition sequence where the kids and Raven are having to evade the disciple soldiers and basically get to this compound as fast as they possibly can. And one of the things they have to do is climb this cliff, at which point Nigel is shot in the shoulder, and it's left unclear whether he succumbs to his injuries at the end of this. But Franz gets pissed, like very, very, very angry about this, and he shoots a helicopter out of the sky, thus furthering his progression into silent death. This is actually his first 3 kills, so good on you, Franz. The kids stop for the night in a cave, and Otto realizes, based on something that Raven says, that the location of the hunt could have only been leaked by one of the members of his group, but he doesn't know who it is. And that's where my biggest bone to pick with this book comes from. So, the back of this book says, in a shocking twist, the first strike against Nero will be a strike against the Alpha Stream. There's a traitor in their midst, and time is running out to discover who it is. This was released before the book actually came out. Now, when you find out that this is a possibility, it's page 199. So you are this far into the book. You are 2/3 of the way into the book when it becomes a possibility that somebody is a traitor. But if you pre-order this book, you know in advance. For that reason, when I pre-ordered this book, I instantly knew it was Laura. Like, I saw the words traitor and I just went, involuntarily, my brain went, oh, it's Laura. Because Laura is the last person that Otto talks to at the end of Zero Hour. Zero Hour was largely about the relationship between Otto and Lucy. We know that we're going to develop the relationship between Otto and Laura soon. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't Laura so that I wouldn't spoil myself, but I knew. If you just sit down and read this, it's harder to predict. But when you have a couple of weeks of prep time, or if you borrow this from the library and then wait to read it until you get home, it's very easy to figure it out based on the back of the book. Now, if you start reading it and if this last paragraph wasn't here, it's very, very difficult to figure out who the traitor is, because you don't know you're supposed to be looking for a traitor until less than 50 pages before you actually find out who it is. You are only wondering who the traitor is for this much of the book. That's not very much. And yet, that question takes up the back of the book summary. And that's my bone to pick with this book, because so I figured out the plot twist in advance, and then because I had several weeks to think about it, I basically built up this book in my mind to have a very different ending than it did. I pretty much figured that what it was going to be is, all right, Laura's betraying the group because she doesn't want to be part of the Hive anymore, and she would rather like not be a supervillain, and she's going to do something like truly, truly evil, and she's actually going to turn out to be a bad guy, and then in a tragic ending, Otto's going to have to kill her. That was what I thought the ending was going to be. And then when I got to the actual ending of this, where she had a motivation, I was sorely disappointed. And I blame that on the back of this book. So they find their way into this old, abandoned, like, Russian military shelter thing that is actually a perfect replica of a 1950s town. It's from the Cold War, and it was for training purposes for Russian soldiers to be able to figure out how to fight in American suburbia, which is just a ridiculously cool concept, and also something that, really happened. There are places like this, and it's a really cool setting. They hide out in a church. There is some, going back to our whole religious metaphor where Otto is Jesus and Overlord is God, and Hive Mind is the Holy Spirit. I guess you could kind of call Laura Judas here, but I'm not sure. Otto takes on the sins of the group at the end of this. There's some thematic something about the fact that they have their final conflict in the church, as well as the fact that Otto and Laura's first kiss occurs in a church, but I don't know what it is. I think that this religious allegory is being stretched a bit too thin. Penny and Nigel are injured. Laura and Tom are set to defend them. Also, there's a moment where Laura declines taking a gun because... And I thought that was out of character for her the first time I read this. I was like, of course Laura would take a gun. I think Mark Walden has forgotten how to write Laura in the past 2 years. No, that's not what it is. She feels guilty about the fact that she's caused the deaths of a bunch of people. Of course, she doesn't want to take a gun. Laura is written very, very consistently in this book. I was way too judgmental the first time I read this. Anyway, the disciples attack them because they are found, because they turn on this beacon that will allow Francisco to find them. So Laura and Tom defend the church where Nigel and Penny are. Franz is basically the lookout, sitting in the church tower, watching the troops and making calls. And Otto, Shelby, and Wing are running this tank. It's very cool. Wing is driving, and then Otto is aiming the tank turret, and Shelby is shooting. We don't know how many people Otto and Shelby kill here, because they definitely kill some people, but we don't get a count. I'm going to count this as like 1+ for Shelby. She killed at least one person, but I don't know how many. Also, Wing runs over some people, but because of the large-scale combat, they completely miss the fact that Anastasia runs into Anastasia runs into the church and activates her trap card, which is, she tells Laura, all right, you need to end this situation or I'll kill your family. Laura's like, all right, and she turns the gun on Tom. So it turns out that what's been going on in this entire book is that Laura's family has been captured by Anastasia Furin and is being held captive. And if she doesn't do what they say, they will be killed. And what this does is really, really interesting on a lot of levels. For one, Otto doesn't notice any of this. Like, the central theme of this book is you think it's about Otto, and it's not. Decker keeps trying to make things about Otto, but it's not. It's about Laura. The book is, you think it's going to be about Otto, but it's not. It's about Laura. You think that Anastasia wants to bring Otto back to the glass house. No, he doesn't. No, she doesn't. She wants to bring back Laura. And it plays into this whole, like, commentary on being a protagonist that this book is doing, which is really interesting. But at the same time, it also sort of brings the responsibility back to Otto as well. He absolutely blames himself for the fact that he didn't see what was going on. And the book is sort of designed so that you blame yourself too. Like, when you read this book for the second time, you're like, man, why didn't I see this? It's so obvious. And I think that that's the real genius of this book. But it also asks us to think about choice. The only full all caps sentence we get in the entire series is Laura screeches, "I had no bloody choice." But I think this is designed to make you think of Lucy Dexter. Her catchphrase was, "There's always a choice." Yes, she could have decided to go talk to Nero and let her parents die. And of course she didn't decide to do that, but it is partially her responsibility. And we find out that the number of people she killed is at least 30. 16 dead guards, and at, quote, almost 20 dead children. And the thing about Laura here is that she's one of the weakest characters in the story. She's emotionally fragile. She's needy. She's afraid. But at the same time, she's terrifying. She flawlessly manipulated not only the 7 other members of her team, but also the adults, and also however many thousand people read this book. People trust her. She's got the entire hive wrapped around her finger. And the thing about her power is that at this point, because Otto's power is hacking, and Laura is a better hacker than she is, at this point her power may as well be considered a superpower. Like, that's just where she's at. And what do we know about superpowers? They will be taken advantage of in this universe. She is where Lucy Dexter would have been if Lucy Dexter had been good. at using the voice. Nobody wanted to use Lucy's voice because she wasn't very good at it. But Laura is that good. Laura is good enough that people are going to come after her family, and she's going to have to make tough choices. But she hasn't learned the responsibility yet to be able to evaluate those tough choices. One of the problems I had with this book on the first read is that it made Laura look weak to me. It reminded me, there's this trope on TV tropes called The Commies Made Me Do It, which is where specifically a female character's forced to give up information because somebody in Russia kidnapped her brother. Like, that is exactly what the trope is. And it's a convenient way to get conflict going without actually betraying the group. But the thing is, even though I judge this book pretty harshly for this being sort of a cop-out, it really isn't a cop-out. I don't think. Because Laura's enough of a character that this will weigh on her. This will affect her actions from here on out. This will change who she is. No spoilers for Deadlock, but she plays an important role in the next book, and we see how this affects the way she thinks. And we also don't yet know what Nero is going to think of this. And like I said, Laura isn't exactly weak. Even though she cracks under pressure, when confronted by Otto and Shelby, she doesn't start crying. I mean, she does, but she screeches at them. She's not a delicate little flower, but she's taken by Anastasia Furin. And we've seen what Anastasia Furin does to weak little girls. She takes weak fighters and makes strong, ruthless killing machines. We know that Laura has already killed a lot of people. I am very interested to see what happens to her in the glass house. And then we get this very, very interesting sentence that I only really noticed was interesting on this reread. Laura says, "This is all my fault. All those people died because of me. I had no idea what they were planning. If I'd known, maybe I wouldn't have. I don't know. Maybe I've been able to stop all of this. Now I don't think I can live with all this blood on my hands." And Otto says, "Laura, look at me. This isn't your fault. You didn't kill anyone. They did." And the thing is that this goes on a little bit, but the thing is that Otto instantly recognizes the thought process that Laura is having when she says, "I don't think I can live with all this blood on my hands." He is tying this back to his biggest trauma, which is that he was captured by the bad guys and forced to kill people. This entire thing where Laura is forced to kill people is a direct parallel to Otto's role at the end of Dreadnought and the beginning of Rogue. She made a dumb decision to try to protect somebody she cared about, and it led to her being forced to kill a bunch of people. So now what happens here is Otto has been basically completely alone for this entire book. He's been around people, but he's felt alone. And the one person who could relate to his problems, Lucy, is dead. And so now he finally has somebody who can relate to his problems for all the worst reasons. Laura can actually empathize with everything that he has undergone. And it's because she killed 30-something people, and now she's been captured by the glass house. Oof. Anastasia captures Nigel, Laura, Tom, and Penny, and then tries to kill Shelby, Wing, Franz, and Otto, so Otto gets a little bit of a level up in his power set. Previously, he couldn't interface with anything that didn't have a computer chip, but now he is able to basically just interface with the electricity directly in Raven's lightsabers and cause it to explode in Anastasia's hand, thus blowing up her hand, and enabling them to get away. So they go back to the Hive, and Otto talks to Nero by himself, and he explains everything that happened, which, like I said, I really needed, because by the end of this, I was like, what's going on? But he tells Nero that he's the only one that helped Laura, and that all of this, other than Laura, is his fault, which causes Nero to expel him, so that he can go spend the next who knows how long chasing down Anastasia Furin to get their people back. Now, what does this mean? The thing is, Otto helped Laura unwittingly. I think that if Otto had told Nero that they had all helped, I think Otto knows they would have either all been expelled or they would have all been allowed to stay. I think Otto wanted to go on this mission by himself without the other students. Because this entire book, he's been thinking about what a danger he is to the other students and how he doesn't want anything bad to happen to Wing and Shelby. So he's going to leave them here. His loneliness is given physical form in that at the end of the book, he's basically sent on this solo mission to go rescue the only person left that he can actually relate to. But at the end, we see that he has Hive Mind and Raven with him. Two people that, while they aren't the same, they don't have the same relationship with him as he's had with Laura and Shelby and Wing. They are close to what Otto could consider to be a family. Shelby has a very palpable older sister vibe, and Hive Mind literally lives in his head. So he's not entirely alone, even though he kind of is. So the final theme that I'd like to pull out is this getting what you wanted, but in a way that you didn't want. Anastasia wants a weapon in Natalia, and she gets one, but apparently Natalia tried to kill her later and burnt down the original glass house. Otto wanted to not be a danger to his friends anymore, and he's not. He's going to go rescue the 4 who were captured from nearly certain death, and he's away from the other students, so he can't possibly be a danger to them anymore. Laura wanted to protect her family, and she did, but only, through killing many other people. Speaking of which, I don't think that the story, even though I do think Nero is going to be very angry with Laura for what she did, I don't think the story wants us to blame Laura. Even though I personally blamed Laura when I first read this, I think the story doesn't want us to. Because we know a couple of other people who have accidentally killed people, or killed people against their will in this series. That's Sume, who created Overlord, Nigel, who created Violet, Otto, who was enslaved with the Animus, Raven, who's also enslaved with the Animus, and Laura here. The story, even though Nero is probably going to be angry, the story expects us to forgive her. And Otto forgives her. And he might be wrong, but ultimately, Otto sees himself in her predicament. And so he doesn't blame her, because if he blamed her, he would be blaming himself, which he can't do. He's trying to cope with what happened. And if he blames her, then he's at fault as well. I really like the fact that it's not Otto's status as a protagonist that gets Laura captured here. It's the fact that Otto assumes everything will happen to him because he's the protagonist. There's a scene where he's talking to Laura on the shroud, and he says, "You look distracted," and she says, I'm thinking about somebody I'm not going to talk to you about." And on a reread, of course, she's talking about the fact that her family has been captured and that Decker is threatening her. But Otto goes, "Oh yeah, you're totally right. We should definitely talk about our relationship after we get back from the hunt. Ha 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 ha." Because he thinks that it's all about him. And it's not. And he thinks that it's all about him because he's the protagonist, because all this stuff has happened to him. And we think that it's all about him because he's the protagonist. All this stuff has happened to him. And it makes us not realize that it's not about him. Which is a very interesting motif for this book. And that's everything that happened in Aftershock. Next week we will be reading Deadlock, which is basically the other half of this one. I liked it pretty much exactly as much as I liked Aftershock because it's a continuation of Aftershock. This is the one where they go to a lot of different places. So we'll just say they go to the glass house. No, okay, they go to Venice in this one. They go to Venice. We meet my favorite minor character in the next book. I'm very excited. This week's discussion question is, do you think it was Laura's fault? Why or why not?